everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Penny Wright. Most of you, many of you I know. There are a few who I don't know. Welcome to each one of you. We're delighted to be co-sponsoring today's program with the Southampton History Museum, of which Richard Behrens, as you probably know, was a director for 7 years. And so we had a lot of fun and interesting collaborations during that period, and he's spoken here a number of times. Some of you know that Richard recently retired as the executive director of both the Thomas Moran Trust and the East Hampton Historical Society. And he is now serving as chief curator for the East Hampton Historical Society. And he also consults with local nonprofits and history organizations. Over the years, he has curated numerous exhibitions, written catalogs, and several books on art and historic architecture. Mr. Behrens co-authored Lost Hamptons and East Hampton, A History in Postcards. His most recent book, which you are going to hear about today, and we forgot to ask him to bring copies to sell, but it can be purchased at Bookhampton. Southampton Books, I think it's called, and probably Bookhampton in East Hampton. His most recent book is titled Behind the Privets, Classic Homes of the Hamptons. And I want to add also that Richard's wife, Roseanne, who's in red in the last row here, was an employee here at the Rogers Memorial Library for a number of years. So we're happy to have them here today. Please, Richard, please welcome Richard Behrens.
It's probably just fine. So, there's a picture of the book. Here's the book. Most libraries don't allow you to sell books in them, and I really hate to be a salesman anyway. And you can get it places, and if you really want to be a bad person, you can get it quite reasonably on Amazon. It just depends on your local point of view. The most interesting thing about almost any book that I have worked on is that I rarely am the one who comes up with the idea. It usually is something that someone says, gee, wouldn't this be a great idea? And then it usually takes several months to con myself into doing something. But Behind the Privets probably had the slowest birth of any book that I've ever endeavored. The idea for Behind the Privets came to me 7 years ago, when two older members of the Maidstone Club, whose families had been summer colonists, and they still remain a part of the community, came to me because one of their father-in-law's extraordinary faux French villa was going to be torn down in the village. And they both thought that the interior was so interesting that people needed to know what the Hamptons, that word that so many people despise, but was invented in the 1840s by the railroad, so you can always blame the railroad. But don't blame the East Hampton Star or any of the other publications for daring to use it. It's been used for that long. That they wanted the idea to come.
There's a little bit of a...
Okay. What they wanted to do is to show people that there was a Hampton style for many, many years, and that there still were houses that either had been built, were still in the same 2 or 3 generations. There were still houses that had been purchased by people that had a reverence for an older style of summer colony life and were maintaining that look. So it sounded So, yeah, it's a really interesting idea. Who would ever buy such a book? But they were adamant. Thought we found an author who dropped out, so that meant that I was the only one left. We found a photographer, Dina Merrill's son, who was a photographer for Vogue and other publications, who has always loved the older houses in the Hamptons. So he volunteered his activity as I volunteered mine to write the book. And then we needed to find a publisher. Well, we had the most interesting conversations with publishers. All of them, after hearing what the book was going to be about, a bunch of old houses in East Hampton with old furniture in them, maybe even pictures of older people, who knows. They were totally thrilled and probably wondered why we didn't go to Wonder Books, possibly, to publish it, or ARP or something. So someone else who was involved with this coterie said, "Oh, I know someone's daughter who I think she's in publishing." Well, in reality, she's a very important publisher with Random House, does mostly books on the Prizel name, which does a lot of very fancy art books for museums in Europe in particular. And because she grew up in one of the houses we were planning on illustrating, she got quite excited about it. That took about 3 years to get that excitement on to anyone else who was sitting on the board of directors at Random House. But all the while, our photographer was out taking photographs. And we would have a meeting every 3 months, and we'd say, "Well, did you try Mr. Rutgers? I mean, his house is really interesting." So anyway, so that's how this book came about. The entertaining thing about it is that though we had a lot of control of all the photographs, etc., the one thing we had no control of was the cover of the book. That's something that the publisher does. So we found it quite interesting, ironic, that the photograph is a photograph of the newest house in the book. So but it's built in an older style. So we were interested in getting some forewords and some prefaces, and we had some ideas, but the publisher was adamant that Alec Baldwin be involved. And in reality, Baldwin wrote a quite splendid foreword, but the interior designer David Meadow, whose family had a summer house, and he still summers in East Hampton, though he lives in California, David wrote probably one of the most lovely prefaces you would ever read about the past, looking somehow, describing East Hampton as being rather like the Galapagos, and you know what happens when too many people come, and it loses its character. So that was very interesting. So, and then there's an introduction that is really the story of, in particular, the development of the summer colony in East Hampton, which developed in the 1840s, a little earlier than what most people have a tendency to think of as the time of the development of the summer people coming from Boston, coming from New Jersey, Newark, coming from New York, obviously, via paddle boats or railroad trains, or early on stagecoaches from Patchogue. And so what we tried to do was to work the book in chronology, starting with some of the earlier examples of houses and why some of these early houses were saved. So it's interesting to note that many of the early summer colonists, and here I'm not going to the first generation, but probably the second generation, the 1880s, the 1890s. Certainly in the case of most of our communities out here, our main streets had a whole lot of very, very old houses on them. And in most instances, some of the summer colonists found an interest in these old houses. A certain sentimentality, a certain sense of nostalgia, If you do research on a lot of the early colonists, summer colonists who came to Southampton, Amagansett, East Hampton, you'll find that they often have ties going back 2 or 3 generations before to Bennets and other families, Halseys and other people who had settled out here. They may not themselves have lived out here, but they thought that concept of a old colonial house in the 1890s, saving it from destruction from Main Street. This house was very near where the theater on Main Street is today, and it's one of many houses that were rescued by one particular woman who just thought that colonial houses were wonderful, and she would save them and move them to different lanes, in particular Egypt Lane, where she would then refurbish them, sometimes furnish them, rent them, or sell them. Mrs. Harry Hamlin. She saved the Hedges Inn from being a naughty beer joint to being the home for several summers of Soulé from La Pavillon in New York for their summer place, because of course during that period big fancy restaurants closed in New York, so he just brought the whole troupe to East Hampton. And she fully furnished it, not in French antiques, I can assure you, but pretty much Victorian furniture. So this house is one that got moved. Simple looking house, which started out a 3-bay wide house, and then got another addition on the side of it. This was owned by, this is Mrs. Hamlin's house. And this is how it's decorated today. She was really interested in what we call the end of the colonial revival, which starts with the centennial in 1876 and probably lived on until at least the 1940s. And if you were a colonial revival person, you really had a tendency to think that houses probably looked much older when they were originally built than they really did. So you would take off the plaster ceilings and expose the beams. And no one apparently ever realized when they took the ceiling off that the beams looked brand new, because of course they had never been exposed to light before. They'd always been covered up. Who in the world would, this house was built probably about 1740. Why would they ever want to have a living room that had beams exposed like a barn? I mean, it made no sense at all. But so here we have a young couple in reality who have acquired a house, and virtually, other than doing the kitchen, of course, and the bathrooms, have maintained the look that Mrs. Harry Hamlin would have had. She would have had a big table like that. She would have had an original Shaker one. This one is not. Pennsylvania decorated furniture, chairs there. And then, of course, there are the houses that have been maintained on their location by summer colonists. Once again, oftentimes related by hook or by crook to an earlier generation. So this is Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island, a building which is considered one of our great Georgian houses of the early 18th century, but pretty much what we see, the wings and the door design on the outside, is pretty much based on a colonial revival. The core of the house is the early house, but even the inside, the paneling that was original wasn't fancy enough for the summer colonists who had acquired the house. So we might say it got tarted up to look a little more colonial. But as is often the case with 18th and 19th century houses, this house is particularly interesting because it really was pretty much in line of the Sylvester family from the beginning. You can really tie it full ways. So the house, the furnishings in the house really represent probably 5 generations of the Sylvester family. And the rooms as we see them today look very much like they did around 1910, 1920. In fact, even some of the curtains probably date from the 1920s or 1930s. This is an upper bedroom Wallpaper, which in this instance is pretty obviously from the 30s. You've got an Empire chest over there, a chaise longue. You've got the lower part of a tall chest turned into a dressing table, an extraordinary looking tabernacle mirror, and a wonderful 1965 lamp on the so-called lowboy with some form of plastic shade on it. So it's this combination of ambiance, of things that are from the past. And to many people, I think we all have memories of wonderful summers that we spent. Places that we haven't been to maybe for 40 years, maybe 50 years. Going out and gathering blueberries in the backyard, or clamming, climbing down the cliffs of the coast of Maine. Not even sure if some of us would climb down those cliffs any longer. But those are bucolic. And there's something about summer sentimentality. So this house is pretty spectacular because if you're looking for an interior that looks like it would have been if you stopped to visit in 1920, all you have to do is just hide that lamp in the closet. Where the house becomes extraordinary and gives up secrets that would not have been particularly thought of by the summer colonists is if you go to the attic of Sylvester Manor, virtually untouched. The newest things up there are Vuitton trunks from the 1920s. Plank walls, whitewashed, with scribbling and scratching. There's scratches of a huge clipper ship. There's figures doing farm work. There are dates from 1740s, up to the 1920s. Old demijohns, which have been empty, and just why throw them out? Why not just put them up in the attic? But this is the ghost of in many ways, the slave that took care of the plantation for so many years. There's a room there that's called the meal room, which locks up. And judging from all of the scratching on the wall, it may have been a place that you might have incarcerated someone who was a little too rowdy, had a little too much rum the night before, and would not be very helpful in the fields. But its original purpose, and the reason it has a big lock on it, is that it was where the sugar, where the grains, where the flour, where all the expensive items that would be used in the kitchen would be stored up in the attic, which is obviously one of the drier areas in the house, particularly on Shelter Island. So it's interesting, you can leave sort of a 1910 elegance and walk up to the third floor, and you're in almost an entirely other world that would have been pretty much used by the summer people as their trunk room. One thing that, particularly in the 1920s, became very popular with summer colonists out here was repurposing barns and sheds into homes. Some people think that it may have been one of the reasons that the great room became so popular by the 1940s and 50s. But this is a repurposed shed, barn, that came from a house on Main Street in East Hampton and was moved behind a house called the Osborne Jackson House. And this is how it was furnished in the 1940s, in a very old sort of English country. You could easily imagine a Yule log in that fireplace, an enormous amount of golf trophies from the Maidstone Club, which are, he never really rose to the silver ones, so they're all pewter with his name on. He usually got third and fourth place. Staffordshire figurines, which were very much in vogue from the 1910 period to probably the 1960s and 70s, mostly spaniels and whippets, anonymous portrait. But isn't it interesting the sort of formal sconces that are above the fireplace? So this house is a really interesting contrast. Once again, a summer house that has a lackadaisical, easy way about the entryway, but it's not quite so lackadaisical if you get inside, and you're going to see a crystal chandelier. And of course, there are the beautiful shingle-style houses that were built all over the east end of Long Island, particularly on the South Fork, in the 1880s, 90s, and onward. And of course, in reality, have they ever gone out of style? We just make bigger ones that are not built as well and not as attractive, except for a few designed by one of the architects who's in the room here, Eric Woodward, who's are all brilliant and perfectly gorgeous in design or something. But anyway, the exception, certainly, rather than the rule. So this one was built, I think, in the 1890s. Here's another example of a house that's built in the colonial style, sort of the colonial farmstead style. And this is a thing you see more often here. I think I know of at least 3 houses. Eric may know of more in East Hampton, which have bay window on the 2nd floor. The Rogers Mansion, I think, has a bay window on the 2nd floor. There's another house down the lane there that has Meeting House Lane that has this. This is a house that was built around 1895, sort of in the woods in the Georgia area of East Hampton. And it's sort of fun because it was rented in the 1950s by an abstract expressionist, Adolf Gottlieb, who turned the carriage barn into a studio. And he drove a very fancy car. That was about the extent of his fanciness. And he was very interested that because he had this very fancy Lincoln town car, that his neighbors, who were all mostly millionaires, took him under their wings quite quickly. But someone told him, if you had come here in a Ford, they wouldn't have even spoken to you. So here's the kitchen. And this house has been in one family now for about 85 years. And there's been very little change. The stove has been electrified, but the table there, which apparently, since we're getting taller, you can see that they had to build up the legs of the kitchen table by about 3 or 4 inches there. You can see the coloration. The simple chairs very much like the chairs that Thomas Moran used in his studio in East Hampton. Baskets, lighting fixtures, which are, in fact, antique lighting fixtures, probably from the 1920s, an old wind-up clock. But it's a rusticity. There's a hooked rug on the floor. The floor is shiny, but you can see that it's been scarred. There's a quality about it that does not enter into Hampton's cottage and gardens, white wall, what we call the Hampton look. And once again, one of the reasons for the book was to show people, how people lived, what their interiors in particular looked like. Here's the upstairs bathroom. This was installed, the family thinks, around 1918. Still has original tub, still has original corner sink. Does it look like something a multimillionaire would tolerate for very long? Of course, they wouldn't tolerate the house. It would have been a tear down and be gone. And something else would be in its place. The rag rug, the natural floors. The only thing it probably would not have been is white walled. Most likely would have been a small patterned wallpaper, but compromise is what houses and living is all about, right? Some of the most wonderful houses of the shingle style period are really sublimely simple, seemingly. Here with the gambrel roof, which extends over the facade and creates a lovely porch, diamond paned glass sash. This one's in the Georgia area in East Hampton. And here's the sunroom. And it's interesting, the owners who have owned this, the owners who have it now are the great-grandchildren of the people who built the house. they are proud to say that they know Grandpa so-and-so bought all this wicker furniture and brought it out from New York around 1905. And it's there. And it's in really pretty good condition. The funny little tables, those little simple stands are from the 1950s, but the seating furniture is all a little older. That blue-green floor covering color for floors is almost the shade of the blue-green that you'll often find in the ceilings of porches. In a porch, of course, it gives you the sense of open air when you're really contained. And look at that wonderful, Cape Cod lamp, that wrought iron lamp. I think if I remember correctly, there's at least 20 of those in this house. And they call them pinochle lamps, probably just because they moved them over to the pinochle table when they were playing cards, but I think they have a number of other names. The kitchen, wonderful stove, in the 1910 period. Funky corner closet there that you have to have a chair to stand on because you probably would have had staff in this house, so you wouldn't have had to climb up there and get the thing on the top shelf. Someone would have been paid for it. And that black and white linoleum floor has a lot of patina on it. It's got to be probably from the 1930s. Fan, of course, modern, because the house is not air conditioned, except for windows. And then there are these big, huge houses in Devon, built by a gang of industrialists who could buy some land that the locals thought wasn't very valuable because it was north of the highway. And they set up a very private community there with some pretty wonderful houses. Their biggest problem was the fish factory in Napeague. When the Manhattan factory was boiling down Manhattans for oil for fertilizer and also for a lubrication of machinery, if the wind was in the right direction, it went right over to the Devon Yacht Club and right over the and there are lawsuits. And of course, it was a time, it's hard to believe, but it was a time when money was a little bit of askance by the locals. So when lawsuit finally got to Albany, they just threw it out saying, it's the industry that's important. They knew about the industry and they built their house there, so, go ahead, boil more Manhattans. But the colony won out, Manhattan business died, so. Here's the stairway in that house, which is really quite remarkable. It looks like it should be in a 1930s movie. And then a little tiny lady's desk there and mirrors. This also, of course, would have been wallpapered in the period of the house, but they really left this house pretty much exactly. It too is in the same family who owned it and had it built. Here's the kitchen, the dining room with the English spindleback chairs, and the whole concept of keeping things that are part of the past. These chairs have been in the house since the house was built. If you look really closely, you'll see a missing spindle. People probably had heart attacks if visitors saw a missing spindle in their chair. So this is it's an old chair. And then you have extraordinary conceits where you have a building that seems to be having no purpose whatsoever other than for sheer total entertainment. And this is the playhouse. one of the Woodhouse, really a masterpiece, still survives. You can't see it from the road. It does not belong to members of the family, but it does belong to the second generation of people who have owned it since the Woodhouse family had it. It was built as a wedding gift, not a wedding gift, was it a 21st or 18th birthday? I think it was 18th, wasn't it? 18th birthday gift for the daughter. Playhouse was decidedly what it was built for. It has a stage. It has a theater organ in it. It has a huge great room. It's very much in that eclectic period in the teens and 20s when we, sort of went through England and France and came up with a lot of half-timbering and Elizabethan, Tudor style buildings. This is the great window on the front. Here is the light in the late afternoon coming in. The furniture in the building is almost all original. Over the years, some of the more important pieces have filtered off to auction houses, but on a whole, most of it is original. It's a red tile floor. It always was the contrast for the half timbering, so it was always a creamy color. Isn't that beautiful? And the lanterns are almost all Venetian lanterns from gondolas. There's a carpet on the main floor that is what today we usually call a castle carpet. It's a huge oriental weaving. The chandeliers are, very medieval. I mean, this, Robin Hood could be hiding somewhere in the corner, perchance, or grand piano, a Steinway. And this is a summer rental. It's been rented for years and years and years and years. And the owners who inherited, I think the husband inherited it from his mother, have kept it up beautifully, have not done anything terrible whatsoever, and spend, usually a few months in spring and a few months in the fall. And we'll often have musical performances here. His mother had a lot of concerts, and during the period when the Woodhouses were here, there were Isadora Duncan danced on the back lawn in reality, and and then back in the later period in the 1930s and 40s, there was across the street, there was a drama school, and so this was often used for Shakespearean presentations. And a number of both gentlemen and ladies would read poetry and would have poetry readings here. Ruth Moran, the daughter of Thomas Moran, may have read here. She certainly read in other houses nearby because summertime seemed to be the time for poetry readings. So that gives you some little clue as to the type of houses. I think there are 34 or something. I see we just bothered to count them, but and there's a little story about each one of the houses. The idea was to try to, in fact, Stan Rumbaugh, the photographer, was adamant that the book had to be a history book. It had to talk about local history. It had to talk about the history of the house. Yes, it talked about interiors, but the interiors weren't necessarily meant to be, looked at and said, well, I'm going to do that with my house. It was more to just let you see about 60 years of houses and summer people and the types of environments that they lived in. Some of the houses, one of the houses that we talk about is Rowdy Hall. When we first came to East Hampton, we were having, I think it was dinner at Rowdy Hall, and there was a person who I think had a little too many tequilas, was going on with his guest that this is the Rowdy Hall where the Tile Club, when they first came out in the 1870s, stayed, and this is where the art colony developed, right here in Rowdy Hall. Well, he was right, but Rowdy Hall used to be next to the Presbyterian Church, and I think it was Mrs. Harry Hamlin who moved it down to Egypt Lane. So you had to go a little walk down to see the one where it really happened. But why was it called Rowdy Hall? It's because the artists who came out, Samuel Coleman and Winslow Homer and a couple other well-known landscape artists in particular, when they were very, very smart. They really wanted to publicize the landscape movement and the genre movement in America. So working with a publication, they came up with an idea of that a reporter would follow the artists on their journey out to the east end of Long Island. They went really to two areas, Islip area and also another few years later to East Hampton and Southampton and on to Montauk, that this person would follow them, talk about artists, and would have the artist illustrate the article, and this would be a way of promoting their work, and in so doing, promoting the East End as a place for artists. The only problem is, for a number of years, historians seem to think that this was why artists came out here, not the fact that artists had been coming out here for 25 years before that time. And it just happened that these guys were smart enough to bring a reporter with them, so they got, two fancy articles about it. But they were not churchgoers for some reason, the artists. I can't imagine why. And so they were staying in a rooming house right next to the Presbyterian Church. So on Sunday morning, they would be rowdy. They'd be out on the front porch, the veranda. They wore very loose-fitting sort of Turkish slacks made out of corduroy and big, wide-brimmed hats that were woven out of natural fiber, and scarves and colorful suspenders. And they would be sitting out there laughing and chatting, and so the church folks thought they were very rowdy. And so forever afterwards, that particular summer domicile was referred to as Rowdy Hall. So you can blame it on the artists. Pollock would have loved it if it hadn't been already moved away and turned into a private house. And we do then end up with several houses designed by Jacqueline Robertson, an architect who really has taken the East End under his wing, particularly shingle-style buildings. And so there's one or two, that's why we go up to sort of modern times, because we show some houses where people have deliberately had the architect follow virtually closely the feeling of a 19th century or early 20th century summer house, and they had moved in and had furnished it very much in the way that you have seen the other houses out here. And also we have an amazing series of photographs that Stan took of his mother's summer cottage, and that is probably the most perfect 1960s cottage. It survives with all of the furnishings that Dina Merrill brought to it. A lot of things from her family's yacht. If you look in the pantry, which is maybe a quarter of the size of this room, all the shelves have this extraordinary crystal with the monogram of the family on it. And the house is a modern thing that sort of stretches out overlooking the water, and interestingly enough was designed by an architect who was known for designing airport terminals. So why not? But it's a very dangerous house for anyone over 40 because every single room is 1 or 2 steps. There's nothing. And it has a sunken living room, of course. So it's got to be one of the best sunken living rooms we have out here. So are there any questions whatsoever? So I'll tell you one other just thing to close. Not used to writing anything that is offered by Amazon and gets reviews. I mean, the book that I did with a friend on postcards of East Hampton wasn't really the type of thing that you would get a review for. So this type of thing you do get a review for. The book is in its second edition now. And where is it most popular? In England and in France.
Really? And
some of that is Pretzel, which does a lot of European publications. But mostly people have been very kind, but there was this really rough reviewer. I mean, really rough. He starts out saying, "I feel sorry for the author and the photographer. That no one in East Hampton who has taste or a sense of beauty would allow these people in their houses to photograph, but rather sheds, barns, and pigsties seem to be the only places where these people were allowed." And really, we have sheds, but I assure you there's not one pigsty in this book. Thank you very much. And if you'd like to look at a copy of it,
thank you, Richard. That was fascinating. We're so happy to have you in our community and learning and researching and writing, so we hope you continue. Thank you all for being here, and thanks so much for very interesting.